It's from the year Tafshin Chav Ches, end of 1967. Let's bring up the text. Now, this Maamar really follows the Maamar that Rebbe said on the 14th of Kislev, which was Pashas Vayishlach of that year, which is a longer, more in-depth Maamar about the concept of Chesed and Gedula. We know that Chesed, the Chashem HaGedula, when we say in Davening, the Chashem HaGedula V'Gvur V'Tiferes, that Gedula is Chesed. And like the Sprata and Chassidus, that the Mekubalim Rishonim, the early Kabbalists, used to call Chesed with the name Gedula. And then later it was changed to the name Chesed. And that Maamar explains why, the difference between Gedula and Chesed. Built on that, we're going to have our Maamar here this week. And we'll bring from parts of the Maamar it's from the Maamar Kentaiti of Tafshin Chav Ches 1967, Parshas Vayishlach Kentaiti, which was the letter that based on the verse in Parshas Vayishlach and based on the letter that the Alter Rebbe writes after his liberation, Yifes Kislev. And this Maamar continues again with the idea of Chesed and how that applies to Yaakov and Yosef and in connection with Yifes Kislev, which is coming up tonight. Again, hopefully we'll finish this Maamar in in 2 or 3 classes, maybe 3 or 4 classes. So the pasuk in this week's parsha says, Eileh Toldos Yaakov Yosef, that these are the descendants or the children of Yaakov is Yosef. Eisav the Medrash teaches like this. The movie appears Rashi Yoshin, and what's called Rashi Yoshin, the older version of Rashi. That what does this pasuk mean? That one of the ideas is Shekasher Yaakov Ras Kol Ha'alufim Haksuvim Lamaila, when Yaakov observes all the final 2 readings of Vayishlach is talking about the great family of Eisav and all the different alufim. Alufim are different generals and kings that are going to come out of the family of Eisav, which talks about the Soif Parshas Vayishlach, the end of Parshas Vayishlach. So Yaakov saw all that. Tama, he questioned and wondered, how is he going to conquer Eisav? How could you deal with Eisav? Look how powerful the descendants of Eisav are, as described at the end of Parshas Vayishlach. This king and that king. These are the kings that were before the kings of Israel, and as it's explained, not just before in time, but also there's a higher level. He was intimidated and overwhelmed with what he saw in the descendants of Eisav. Machsiv lemata. So what happens after that? When Yaakov was wondering how was one going to deal with Eisav and his descendants, so the Torah continues, Eileh Toldos Yaakov Yosef. So Rashi explains from the Tanchuma that these are the descendants of Yaakov Yosef. And he quotes based on the Haftorah of the prophet that says, V'hayi beis Yaakov eish, that Yaakov is like a fire. Beis Yosef lahava is like a flame. Beis Eisav lakash, and Eisav is like straw. And what happens to straw when you put a flame to straw? It burns. Nitzutz yotze mi Yosef, one spark goes forth from Yosef. Shemekalev v'sarif v'skulim burns up the whole house of Eisav. Yaakov is intimidated what he reads about Eisav. So the Torah says no. That Eileh Toldos Yaakov Yosef comes Yosef, and Yosef, the spark that comes forth from Yosef, will destroy whatever this, so to say, this straw kingdom of Eisav that looks so powerful and dominant is really just a house of straw, and a spark from Yosef will burn it, destroy it. Now Rashi quotes this idea before. Rashi quotes, why does Yaakov leave Laban to go face Eisav on his way back to his parents, to his father in Canaan, in Hebron, is when he quotes again this pasuk, that when Yosef was born, so no longer was Yaakov intimidated by Eisav. But this Medrash is following that idea, based on the same principle, that whatever would intimidate him about Eisav, Yosef fixes. Yosef calms, so to say, this fear. Because Yosef, the spark that comes forth from Yosef, will destroy anything that Eisav builds. Obviously, the question is going to be, why Yosef, not Yaakov? If Yosef is the son of Yaakov, and Yaakov is also fire, so why do you need the spark coming from Yosef specifically? So the Rebbe asks, seemingly the question would be like this. If Yaakov, first the Rebbe asks the fundamental question, which is, because Yaakov is the attribute of truth, meaning that whatever Yaakov feels comes from a place of absolute truth. And like we know, the midas emes has to be emes from outside. I mean, there's no part that there should be Anything that doesn't agree with, if truth is truth from every direction, there's no angle where if something's true, there is no angle that truth is not true. So if Yaakov is the attribute of truth, midas emes, if Yaakov is concerned and scared of the alufei Eisav, of the generals and kings of Eisav, the kingdom of Eisav, is a proof this that he was concerned, and the strength of Eisav is true because Yaakov is true. And if Yaakov has a fear, it's something he's only fearful of something that's true. It means Eisav exists, and Eisav is intimidating, and therefore Yaakov, who is the attribute of truth, is intimidated by what he sees from Eisav. Because if there was nothing to be fearful of, why would he be scared? If Yaakov is the attribute of truth. So if the fear wasn't true, that doesn't go together with Yaakov's attribute of truth. It means even if he has a fear, the fear also has to find place in truth. So it means to say that the fear has its justification. So if that's the case, if there's something to be afraid of, what do we say? That Eisav is only a paper tiger. A house is only made out of kash, only made out of straw, which indicates it's like a straw building that's nothing. A little spark will burn it down. One spark coming out of Yosef will burn the whole house of Eisav. So how could you say that Yaakov was scared? If he's scared, that means it's true. If he's true, how could you call it kash? How could you call it just a house of straw? An additional question. What does it mean in the verse itself that it says that the house of Yaakov is fire? That Yaakov is fire and Yosef is the flame. The mashma, from this we see, it's not the same thing. The fact that the terminology is different of fire and flame means that they represent two ideas. And although it says that the spark comes through from Yosef to burn Eisav, but the Torah testifies, the prophet testifies, it's in Yeshaya, I believe, or it's Yeshaya, or it's Avodah, that there's Yosef, there's a Yaakov that's fire, and there's Yosef that's Lahava, which is a flame, and together the spark goes out of Yosef and burns down the house, the kash, the straw of Yosef. So we see that there are two ideas. And need both to nullify Eisav. But then that doesn't continue, it doesn't go on with the continuation. Because the continuation finalizes in the statement and says, that only a spark goes out from Yosef, doesn't mention Yaakov. That burns everything. Seemingly, it's just a little spark that comes from Yosef that burns the straw house of Eisav. So why do we have to mention the fire of Yaakov? Seemingly that the fire of Yaakov is a necessity. Then we don't. When it comes to ridding the straw entity of Eisav, it's only a spark that goes through from Yosef. It's only one spark. So what is this fire of Yaakov and the flame of Yosef, and what's the necessity of both of them, and why do we only say that one spark goes forth from Yosef to destroy the straw entity of Eisav? So the Havin said to understand all this, the Rebbe says now he's in reference to the Maamar he spoke about in Parshas Vayishlach Ketointi. So we have to base on what we said before, meaning in the Maamar that the Rebbe said the previous Shabbos in Parshas Vayishlach. And on Yudal Kislev, Bibir Egeres HaKodesh, this that it says in Egeres HaKodesh, Diramaskul Kotonti. This is the letter that the Alter Rebbe penned after his liberation from Yutas Kislev, which the idea of the letter was the humility the Chassidim should feel, as opposed to feeling that because the Alter Rebbe was arrested, because of those who falsely accused the Alter Rebbe of siding with the enemies of the Tsar, or those who were really fighting the ideas of Chassidus that really bothered them, the ideas of the teachings of Chassidus, especially as they're being taught by the Alter Rebbe. So now that the Alter Rebbe is victorious, maybe the Chassidim will kind of feel over and have an egotistic feeling over, so to say, their adversaries, those Misnagdim that were fighting against the Alter Rebbe. So the Alter Rebbe specifically penned a letter called Getainti, of humility, that we have to be humble And specifically when we see miracles, and specifically the type of miracles we see, and specifically the closeness we see that Hashem shows us in these miracles, that should bring out a feeling of humility as opposed to a feeling of ego. And based on the idea of katanti, the word katanti means katan. I've been humbled. I've been made to feel small. Because of Admar Zaken, that Alter Rebbe writes this letter when he came back out of prison in Petersburg. After he came out of Petersburg, and in that letter, the Alter Rebbe explains that there's a difference between the chesed of kedusha, kindness that comes from the attribute from these places of holiness, and the attribute of chesed, kindness, which is from the right side, that comes to l'umazah, that comes from the nations. Meaning, there's kindness that is a holy kindness, and there's a kindness that is represented by the nations, which is represented by Yishmael. And in the Maamar that the Rebbe talks over there it's not, there's two ideas. There's the kindness, how it affects the person, and the effect the person has from the kindness is how it draws down the kindness. Yeah, so he explains that there's a concept of chesed of Avraham, the kindness that's represented by Avraham, and how Yishmael separates himself from chesed. Yishmael, which is the son of Avraham before the circumcision, is chesed of Yishmael. Chesed of Yishmael. That the more kindness they see, the more gifts God showers on them, the more it builds up their ego. Someone who's holy, the kindness that God shows to us should have the effect of humility. You're humbled by God's kindness. Avraham, as Avram said, from all the kindness that God gave him, that he felt, I feel like dirt and ash. And like the Rebbe explains in the Maamar, what's the idea of dirt and ash? Like we've talked about many times, that just as a tree is made up of the four elements of Eish, Mayim, Ruach, Afer, which is fire, water, earth, and wind. And then combined in a certain way, everything's made out of those four elements. But let's say, as for an example, a large, huge tree. So when you have those elements made in the way, the formula that would create a tree, so when they're together, they have this huge tree. If the elements separate, let's say there's a fire and it burns, so the water leaves, the wind leaves, the fire leaves, what's left is just the offer, the dirt, which turned into ash. And what is it? Just a pile. There's no form of the tree anymore. So and although that ash comes from the tree, but if you looked at the ash, you wouldn't even know its origin, that it comes from a huge, powerful tree, because it's been so separate from that. So too, Avram Avinu felt like ash and earth compared to the chesed of Atzilus, to the chesed of Hashem. That's how far distant he was. So the kindness that Hashem showed him, it brought humility from Avram. And also Avram, on the receiving side, because we know that the relationship between Mashpia and Makabel, between the giver and the taker, is not just that how the person receives something or how someone gives something, but when there's a relationship, it's specifically how the receiver, the Makabel, receives something, is how it draws from the taker that gives, the Mashpia that gives something. So too, because Avram, his whole identity is bittul, it's drawing from a place of bittul, the chesed. That's what it says. It affects bittul on the receiver, on the makabel. Like Avram says, I feel humbled, like earth. V'gam pulase, in effect, because Avram is humbled. Shall Avram b'hashbasa chesed, how the chesed comes from the mashpia, because there's a bittul in the mashpia that is responding to the bittul, to the nullification of the makabel, of the receiver. So the whole transaction is a transaction of bittul, both from the side. It means the mashpia. Here the Rebbe is going to go into the idea that chesed. The Rebbe uses very strong language about chesed. The chesed comes from a weak character. The fact that you're sensitive to someone's plight, to someone's situation, is a way of bittul. The stronger person that would be strong, you could call it strong or arrogant, or disregard. So therefore there's no hashba. The person doesn't want that the entity, the mashpia, doesn't want to give. It's only because the mashpia is humbled. So therefore the mashpia responds to the makabel, to the receiver. So there's the relationship between the mashpia and makabel is a relationship of bittul. That's what we're saying. There's two things. There's the bittul on the receiving side, and there's a bittul on the giving side. Avram being have bittul has an effect on the hashpa, on the flow that's coming from the mashpia, from the giver of chesed, because of the bittul both in the mashpia and the makabel. That's all chesed of kedusha. So the ingredient of chesed of kedusha is bittul. Hashenkin chesed luma, the chesed of the nations, which is represented by the chesed of Yishmael, or the other side. Luma means the size of non-kedusha, of impurity, which is represented by the chesed of Yishmael. The more the person receives chesed, the more it builds. To translate all the words here, the more the chesed is larger. It grows with ego, the ruach, and high spirit, and a broad heart. Look how great I am. I'm such a great being. Look how much God only gives me the blessing. So I must be someone special. The chesed you get from Hashem only builds your ego and inflates your ego. But Tamadav, and here it says not just because the receiver again has an inflated ego. The hashpa, the giving side, is also an expression of gedula, of greatness, of let's call it ego in this case. That the giver is giving out of a place of ego, and the receiver, his ego is inflated by receiving. So in the place of kedusha, it's the receiver is humbled by the kindness, and the kindness was given in the way of humility as a response to the receiver's humility. In the place of the opposite, in the place of tumah, of impurity, which is called chesed of Yishmael, the receiver Yishmael is inflated by the kindness, look how great I am, and also the mashpia is giving as a way of ego. Look what I can do. Means if the Rebbe died, you say the story about the person that the Rebbe asked to do a hidden tzedakah. The person says, no one's going to know. I give a hidden tzedakah at the time communist, they had to sponsor Pesach, matzahs. So no one's going to know. Not I'm calling that the chesed of Yishmael, but that's the concept where the chesed itself is coming from. What's in it for me to give? So he says, just like in holiness, the chesed causes the person who receives the chesed a humility, because also the reason the chesed was given was from humility. It's a humble relationship. I'm humbled to be able to give. And that's felt in the receiver, and that brings humility that I was the one that was receiving from you. The whole basis of this transaction of the chesed is built on humility, both from the giver, both from the taker. Making bloomers on the contrary, from the forces of negativity, that both on the receiving and the giving end, it's from a point of strength, meaning a point of ego, a point of self-awareness. I'm so happy I could give. I'm so happy I received. It makes me feel so much better about myself. Look how great I am, I received. And that's a response to look how great I am to give. And if you think about it, it's pasha in the nature of things. If a person were to give something, and the idea of giving is to inflate yourself. So if on the receiving side, the person is humbled, so that could be, you don't feel like, who's that person worthy of my giving? But if the person meets your self-inflated feeling, so that's like that's a marriage of ego, both the receiver and you want to give to something that's successful. And for instance, if you have people that would only give to something that's successful, even though by giving they have enough, but it's never enough. So you give more. Where you could give instead of giving to a place that has so much, you could give to someone who has nothing. But the nature of a lot of people is only to give to the place where the receiving side is inflated, because it makes you feel better that I'm giving to something. The inflation attracts you because it's really a mirror to how you're feeling. you want to feel inflated, and therefore when the fact that the person receives it feels inflated, you feel like you're giving to something important, as opposed to finding an opportunity, on the contrary, to give to someone who's humble. Maybe not be, it's not a, so it doesn't, there's no reflection of your inflated, you think in theory. We have the concept that says that there is a concept of mountains and valleys. And in order for a mountain to permeate outwards, like the stamp, so that the receiver has to pull inwards to make space. It's not always like that. And in this case, he says, chesed sometimes, inflated chesed only responds to inflated ego on the receiving side. Because what inspires the giving side is also from a place of ego, from toikev, from strength. He explains, just finish this paragraph. So he explains like this, that this in this Maamar, from the Shabbos before, partially Yishlach, there the Rebbe discusses that there's what's called chesed levar, chesed legav. There's the sort of say the lower chesed levar, like almost from the word outside, from yichutz, which is from an expression of bittul, and there's milgav, from above. So the whole idea of chesed levar, which is the lower, so to say the chesed from outside. This is called chesed, the world of ma is bittul, ma anachnu, right? Moshe says, anachnu ma, we're nothing. Ma is the name of Hashem that comes in place of bittul. And the bittul allows for the person, for the giving side, the chesed, recognizes creation, the nevraim, the creation. And it takes place, and therefore there's a need to give because they're lacking. Therefore, the attribute of chesed gives towards the nevraim, the creation, the levar, it's separate, it's lower because they need. Here the Rebbe says about the nature of certain people that give. And we see some people that are givers, the people that are givers, the Rebbe says the majority of the time, they're not strong-natured people. Although sometimes you find actually the strongest people as have the ability to give, but we're talking about like in a way, on a certain level. The Rebbe says most of the time, the attribute of a Geimel Chesed person gives it is because you feel weak to the other person's need. And the Rebbe says mitzad teva hachlishus, because there's a certain weakness in the nature, va'bitul, a nullification of the giver. Shlehem negelem tzarazulas, they could be sensitive to the pain of someone else. Because they're not egotistic in their own eyes. They have space to recognize other people's needs. And when someone else is in pain, it hurts them because you're not full of yourself. If you're full of yourself, how could you have space for someone else's pain? But because there's humility, and he uses the word chalishus, which is weak, which is an interesting term. When we say therefore you're awakened, you're inspired to give, to be mashpia, to give chesed. But someone who has a stronger nature, the nature of strength does not allow for this person to be affected by the pain of someone else, because you're not sensitive to it from the strength of your character. So too, there's a concept of that above. This that we say that the attribute of chesed from Ze'er Anpim, the small complexion, meaning to say the chesed of Atzilus, it's because there's this level of feeling of self-nullification that's sensitive to the needs of creation. The Rebbe says even more than that. Why is chesed in existence? Why is there that attribute of giving? Is because there's a sensitivity and sort of say a bittul, nullification at the core, to be sensitive, to respond in a way of kindness. Very close is because where does the world come from? The world of Atzilus. And the world of Atzilus itself is Eileh Tzimtzum, comes through a contraction. It doesn't have the toikev, doesn't have the strength of the shem. Hashem's name, Yud, is already a contraction, that it comes down to a Yud, and then it expands to Hey. So the whole world of Atzilus comes from, so to say, the strong language the Rebbe is using, the kulsha, which means weakness, a weakness in the manifestation of God. And therefore, there's a space for sensitivity for someone who needs, or something that needs. Very close is house as it's brought down in Kabbalah. When the entity, the essence of God filled all the existence, there was no space for anything. When there was a tzimtzum, that void created an opportunity for sensitivity. And for there to be a place for the world, means in this, because if without the tzimtzum, there would be all godliness. How could you have a world, which means a world of creation? Is because there's a void of revelation of godliness. God is mitzamtzim, he contracts himself. God had to move. The great light had to sort of say, I mean, if you're talking about it from way of Kedusha, we have to be very, very careful the words we choose over here, but there's almost sort of say the Gedula has to, that's what the difference in Gedula and Chesed. Gedula is the feeling of self, the real true feeling of self and godliness. God had to get away his feeling of self in order to make space for creation. And the Rebbe says in the idea that God had to move the light to contract it so there could be a world as a way of self-nullification within himself and nullifying the Ratzon, because the Ratzon of Hashem is the will of Hashem, the want of Hashem is limitless. To be limited in space creates a void, and in that void is a weakness, again using my words lightly, but just that's the words the Rebbe uses, which creates an opportunity for a response to be sensitive to give. Benimtza. She's havas chesed zah. How does chesed of zah come? Just like the whole existence of the world of Atzilus. Why the inyan hashiflas v'abitla comes from shiflas, the lowly, humble feeling, because it's lowly and humble because of the void of the absolute light. Therefore, chesed itself is nullified, and therefore it's in a way of bittul, and it gives from a way of sensitivity, like a person who's sensitive because of, so to say, a weak character, that you're sensitive to someone else. There's an inner bittul, an inner self-nullification that allows for you to be sensitive to other things. And therefore, the avodah, when we do something, the avodah of creation, mages, touches the attribute of chesed to respond, to give. According to what they do. Otherwise, why would you respond? Why would Hashem even respond to that? Now, again, this is a followation. Next class, before we start the class, I'm going to give more of a background of the previous Maamar where the Rebbe breaks down the difference between Gedula and Chesed, because Gedula is the level of Chesed in the opposite, in the positive. It means where Yishmael comes from, really, the Umasa says that it comes from a place of Gedula. There's a Gedula of holiness. But but in the system of creation, there's no place for Gedula of holiness. It has to be from humility, and there the attribute of Chesed is response in a way of humility as opposed to in a way of Gedula. Because if you leave Gedula in creation, then what siphons off that is a negative energy. Humility is a safe space for Chesed. Ego doesn't work in creation because the negative forces only take the ego part of it, not the giving, not the holy part of the ego. There's a holy ego. But in this world, ego is negative. And therefore, the only tool, the answer basically is the only tool for Eisav is Yaakov. Because Yaakov is the attribute of emes, the attribute of humility, of tikkun, that's the only tool in creation for there to be a transfer of chesed, that it remains in a positive way. Therefore, the person who receives chesed is nullified. He doesn't feel ego. I'm humbled, I'm small, I'm made small from all God's kindnesses to me. All it does is blows up his ego even more. Look how much God shines, look how special I am. God made me rich, made me important. And also, where is he drawing from? He's not drawing from the chesed of bittul. Chesed of bittul will never give you shmo. He's drawing from above, the unlimited chesed, that is a chesed that's based on gedula, ego, but because in this world it comes down in a way of corruption, it only enhances a negative ego. Because where does it come from? It comes from the level of gedula, which is chesed above, not the chesed way it comes into this world, as explained in length in the Maamar of the previous Shabbos, that I'll give a little more background to before we continue this Maamar in hopefully tomorrow, same time. Okay, have a wonderful rest of your day and good Yom Tov with the Kislev tonight, etc.